to 15 minutes.
Right, okay. So we need to be fairly brief, but there's so many questions that I have off the back of those two presentations. I think I'm going to zero in actually on the commercial aspect of the work that both of you are doing so that we can understand how biodesign may touch us in our everyday lives. Both of you have worked with commercial companies, and I want to start with you actually, Suzanne, because you made a very good point during your presentation about the SPIBA time of proof of concept, developing the protein-based spider silk synthetically, and then actually launching a product. It's over 12 years to get to a level of commercialization, and even then, it's limited edition. So tell me a little bit about the conversations you're having with brands and how far we are from actually implementing this to scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the thing that I obsess over on a daily basis. So for me, this journey of biodesign is one that's nearly 2 decades in length. And, you know, if there's a famous quote by Steve Jobs about how the 21st century really is the century of biology. And that word century is the right way to think about this, because actually we're talking about just the beginnings of a journey where we know that biology is going to be the future in so many regards, but we're just at the beginning. And I think it's really worth, you know, when you come from design, we work generally in a very fast-paced way. We're impatient by nature. We expect to get our hands immediately on the thing that we're working with. And a lot of our learning is done through making. And this is very different. And it can be years before you can even get your hand on the product that you then want to shape and form. And you do that, and then that helps you understand what it can do. So, you know, a very, very big learning, I think, for anyone coming into this space is patience. And as much as the world is desperate for more sustainable solutions here, now, today, we have to understand that a lot of what we're talking about is going to be decades in the making, and a lot of money and a lot of cutting-edge science really required before we get there. So it's a slow journey, and along the way there will be some wonderful things that come out, and maybe a few things that we don't like and that test us and really should shape our thinking.
Well, that's what OpenCell's about, isn't it? It's about giving designers an opportunity to put some roots in the ground and get some of these experiments through to a point where perhaps they can be developed within a scientific framework and then launched eventually into a commercial sphere.
Yeah, I guess it's really there to provide the infrastructure to go beyond the speculation and to kind of like, it is also like at an early stage also the laboratories haven't really evolved. They're also adapting now to the new field. So it's quite interesting to see how the infrastructure has to look like, and it has to be affordable, and it also hasn't been really outside of scientific institutions. As Suzanne said, it's a highly interdisciplinary field, so you really have to build as well the environment to be able to collaborate, and it is really bridging research with industry. It's kind of a little bit this gray zone. So that's what OpenCell is about, to, I guess, test out how their first products could look like or will look like.
Sure, and I guess at the moment a blueprint is being written for the way that this interdisciplinary field will grow and established. And I guess that's where you guys come in at the Fat Duck. You're a member of the food industry, bringing your insights.
And I suppose in a way we're freer because we're not necessarily constrained by the strictness of scientific method, and we can have a go at things that aren't necessarily scientifically provable or repeatable, but we can observe their reaction on people and learn from that. And I think creativity has an element of lack of fear to be truly creative. So you know when you set off on a creative journey, you're going to get 99% of things absolutely wrong. And it's not going to work, and it's going to frustrate the hell out of you every single day. But as long as you keep having a go, you've got a chance of getting to somewhere that might be of interest or value, but you will learn on the journey. And I think it's Einstein, I know we all quote people all the time, but I think it's Einstein that said, those who haven't failed haven't tried. If it's not him, I apologize if you're making notes, but someone said it, and it makes sense to me. And I think there's a big element of that in where we are in this field. There's a lot of new things to discover, a lot of a very rudimentary scientific understanding of what these mechanisms are, but that shouldn't necessarily stand in our way from exploring it and getting in there and just seeing what we can make and produce and learn from. And I've got no doubt the science will come eventually to prove all of these things one way or another, but that shouldn't necessarily be a barrier.
So tell me a little bit about what you're doing at the Fat Duck in the kind of wider context of the food industry, because it's very clear that you're creating experimental experiences within the four walls of the Fat Duck in Bray. What's beyond those walls, and how is what you're doing influencing Waitrose, for example?
Well, I mean, that's a big challenge. I mean, obviously, we have very little influence on how Waitrose operates and the other products that it sells, and we have some influence over the products that we sell for Waitrose. Obviously, we design them, but in terms of bringing in new techniques and new ideas, we don't necessarily lead them, but we can interest them. I mean, we see ourselves as maybe being a candle to follow, and if we can be interested in it, we have some power in the marketplace. I mean, we see our restaurant model, if you like, to be a bit like Formula One. So the Fat Duck is our Formula One team. You know, it's very high end. We're very experimental. We try and push boundaries wherever we can. You know, we don't tend to worry about the parameters of price point and cost when it comes to developing things. We go for the idea and try and get there, and that has a trickle-down effect into the rest of what we do, and the impact on which we have on the wider food world. I mean, we don't get to control. But in our own, if something great happens that we can develop in the Fat Duck, we then look for other ways around the business to implement that. So whether that be a food technique or an ingredient or a recipe, you know, we tend to cross-pollinate the other restaurants we have. We have 4 or 5 other restaurants at a much lower concept level than the Fat Duck, but still, in terms of food delivery, very on point in terms of technique and quality of produce and everything. So we tend to filter those ideas down. So that's how we make it work. We have ambitions to be in every space we can possibly get into with our ideas, but we don't have a huge amount of influence over the bigger consumer picture. Unless through the seeds of change we can do that.
And so I'd like to then now touch a little bit on what you were saying, Suzanne, about sustainability and the imperatives around finding much more sustainable options food-wise and material-wise. Can you tell me what your main focus is in that area right now and where you see the most hope and most sort of opportunity from a materials perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think where a lot of people are at is trying to understand comparable materials. So, you know, there is very little black and white in the material world. There's a lot of material innovation happening, but it's not all beneficial. So what are the things that we should be looking out for? And it's certainly in the field of sort of bio, you know, there are bio-based materials, there are biomaterials, there are biofabricated materials. That's not all the same thing. It gets complicated very quickly. And so I think that there's a real need to dissect that and to look at, you know, what is the origin of the inputs, what's the impact of everything from the resources that are going into a system. You know, I think it ultimately is about really how we think about new systems of, you know, discovering materials, manufacturing with those materials, and, you know, how that actually operates within a much broader system. But within bio, you know, we were having a discussion earlier about, you know, biomimicry and all of these things. It's not all the same thing. So you actually, huge amount of education to be done so that people understand that just because it's called a biomaterial doesn't mean it's good for the planet. And it could be that a plastic actually is the right solution for the thing that you're thinking about, but it's a case of how we use it. So things get complicated very, very quickly, and there's a lot of education that's needed, both, you know, new designers emerging, but also at the consumer brand end, where people have very long and complex supply chains, and it's tough to get them to change. So
it's also very tough to understand, you know, the life cycle analysis of one product versus another, and especially if you're designing a new system that isn't a legacy system, that's complex in itself, navigating, you know, the consumption and the resources required for that may be not yet known. And from your perspective, James, have you got a focus on sustainability at all at the Fat Duck? What's your standpoint on that?
Oh, well, we do. We try and be sustainable and recyclable and all the things everywhere we possibly can. I mean, obviously, it's much more difficult and challenging at the Fat Duck in terms of sort of product sort of provenance, because some of the ingredients we have are quite specific to certain dishes that we make, and they're not mass produced, so it's very hard to police that. But we try where we can to definitely do that. I mean, I think that's important for everybody in life now. I don't think you can afford to do any work anywhere in any field without having at least some part of your mind on about the future and the legacy and sustainability. So yes, we do, and obviously other parts of the business are much easier. So we've tried to remove as much unnecessary single-use plastic from our restaurants. We have one inside Heathrow where we're moving obviously completely away from single-use plastics where we can, because it's a much higher volume, fast turnaround restaurant. And we're actually working. One of the goals of Helen and I in another project is to create I suppose a dining ware out of mycelia would be wonderful, but potentially we're very early stages, and my vision of it is a long way from the reality of where it is now. But we would love a totally reusable, or if it's single use, living, dining ware that people could eat from, and the dish which would enhance the flavour with its own fruiting bodies. So we're looking at all wild and wonderful ideas to do whatever we can.
Well, maybe step one is the mycelium bar on Thursday night at the LDF opening.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
I've got one more slightly left field question for you that came to mind when you were giving your presentation around the idea of sensory experience and how hearing and certain sounds can influence taste.
Yes.
And it got me thinking, will there ever be a Heston Blumenthal Spotify download that acts as a meal?
Oh yeah, now sonic seasoning is something we talk about an awful lot, and actually, interestingly, there's something you can try when you get home. It tends to work with wine. So if you don't drink, I'm trying to think maybe some other. It needs to have a bit of acidity in it. So maybe some kind of grape juice, not too sweet, but. We talk about two things. So the sonic seasoning, which is one, which you can adjust. If you can play sharp sounds, which affect the way that your taste buds are on your tongue. So that certainly heightens certain sharper acidic flavors in wine. But another one to try is emotional feeling. So if you have to take the same glass of wine, and you start off by thinking of a person that fills you with just unbridled joy, just someone who only you think of happy thoughts when you see them, could be whoever it is in your life. Just think of them, focus on them, and try the wine, and then do the opposite. Take the second sip, thinking of someone who fills you with pure hatred and bile. Just someone that even their name can make you feel slightly on edge. Just try that when you're later on, and just see the difference it makes to your flavour reception of the product. And I think I would be very surprised if you didn't find it very interesting. But certainly, we play around with sonic seasoning as an idea that obviously, in a bigger picture, anything that can reduce salt and sugar in food is great. If you can do that by playing a little bit of Led Zeppelin, then that's great, isn't it?
Or give us, those terribly resource-intensive foods like meat sonically.
Yeah.
Save our.
I mean, certainly you can create a change of flavour perception with sound. Whether you can create the nutritional fulfilment element is the second question, which I think still your body is going to need some kind of calorific input.